Whether it's a sequel, a new entry, a spiritual successor, or just a game made by the same developer, comparison between games will always exist. When a game blows up in popularity, comparisons are bound to be made. Comparisons aren't inherently an issue though. The real issue appears when the merits and ideas a game have are completely ignored because a similar game in the same genre is more popular. This is really how we ended up with every difficult game such as SMT and Cuphead being called the Dark Souls of their genre, or how every pixel art top-down JRPG is called the clone of Earthbound. These comparisons diminish the effort and thought that goes into these games and ends up putting the more popular ones on a pedestal. The topic of this video, however, is the impact of a popular video game on the next release. Now, before I get into the games, there's no need to worry, there won't be any spoilers to anything mentioned in this video. The first example of this is the reception of Fire Emblem Engage after Fire Emblem Three Houses. While critically, Engage wasn't really an issue, within the fanbase there was a completely different story. There were complaints on every single aspect of the game that was different from Three Houses. The art style, the characters, the story. While there are definitely things that people don't really discuss so much months after the game has been released, the stigma is still there. The other day, I saw a tweet that was mad that a character's hair color was slightly different even though it's just because the art style of the game is different. Let's start with the main complaint between the two games though. While Fire Emblem Engage's story isn't nearly as complex and intertwined as Three Houses is, it doesn't set out to be. It has a simple plot of this important leader taking his friends across many different environments to gather the Emblem Rings and bring the nations together. All of this is done in order to take down a big evil dragon. This doesn't mean the story is overly simple though, it just is much easier to digest and comprehend than Three Houses' war conflict. Engage is going for a much more fun tone with the characters, who are all much easier to get the general feel of without having to establish them too much. Three Houses, on the other hand, is going for a darker plotline where there are traitors, constant threats, and no real correct ending, so much that I still see people argue at which one is the best. Three Houses' characters are all super distinct and all have connections with one another that are tied into the story's roots. The objectives of these games' stories could not have more of a different goal. While I do think Three Houses succeeded much more at creating its narrative, without it, Engage probably would be a better game. And the main reason for that is the gameplay. For as much as I love Three Houses, I found its gameplay in the monastery very difficult to understand at first, or I simply wasn't invested in the things it expected me to do. The game feels like there is too much to do in a singular playthrough. This is most likely intentional, because to experience the whole game, 4 playthroughs would be necessary. That doesn't mean the gameplay is bad though, since it is only half the game and you can use the automatic features if you don't want to do it yourself. The tactical side of the game is good and a standard solid entry to the series with nothing really new and nothing super different than others. Unfortunately, the game brings back weapon durability because that's a mechanic everyone loves in their games. Meanwhile, Fire Emblem Engage adds a whole new mechanic to the gameplay and makes the gameplay look more mainstream, keeping the old options in if you want. Outside the tactics gameplay, you can still become friends with all the characters without a time restriction and with tons of extra content to explore. The developers must have known it'd be difficult to follow up Three Houses if they tried to use a similar gameplay and story loop, so they opted for a completely different experience. If it wasn't for the popularity of Three Houses, a lot of the initial criticism in the community wouldn't have been so harsh. The second game I want to talk about is Soul Hackers 2 and the impact of Persona 5 Royal. While these games are both made by Atlus, they also serve completely different goals with how they are set up. Persona 5 Royal is a perfected version of a game that was already really good, and Soul Hackers 2 is essentially an attempt to bring a series into a bigger audience. Because of the success of Persona 5 Royal, Sega, the publishing company for everywhere except Japan, even expected Soul Hackers 2 to sell really well, and the game underperformed hard. While there are plenty of reasons for this financial flop, such as its marketing, the main reasons were contained within the game itself, such as its day 1 DLC, performance issues on PC, and repetitive gameplay. While the game looks great and has its own unique art style, because of the Persona influence, many of the original Soul Hackers fans were put off by the new design choices. While the game isn't bad by any means, the issues at launch definitely didn't help it last. Plenty of the reviews that were released all compared the game to Persona 5, which had another re-release 2 months later on all platforms. Persona 5 being a game with more content, more popularity, a very vocal fan base with subjectively better music and gameplay. In the eyes of many, why would they buy a game that is just decent when a critically acclaimed game is coming out in the same genre by the same developers? Their release timing could not have been any worse for themselves. In the end, I think this bad release timing, the issues with the game, and poor DLC practices really managed to affect the success and public perception of the game. To wrap it all up, a big issue with a game blowing up in popularity is the impact of people's perspectives of other games. It can paint a different picture and diminish change the value and effort into releasing a game. When a game is released and only compared to another, it becomes so much harder for the game to have its own identity. People who may hate the limited time mechanics of both Persona 5 and 3 Houses may love Soul Hackers 2 and Engage because they removed them. It would get more people into the games that people love because while they are similar, they do have distinct differences. In conclusion, try to see what makes the game unique and an individual experience instead of just complaining and wanting an equivalent to the NBA 2K games and FIFA.